Anyway, real quick, before we get to the Wednesday night reviews, and then I crawl back in my sick bed, you recommended me a book that you have not read yet, but that I got and read over the holiday break. It is Rolling Thunder by Scott Stevens, and it's the golden age of roller derby and the rise and fall of the LA T-Birds.
Yeah, I have it here in my book pile. I haven't had a chance to get to it yet, but I can't wait. I used to love when I was a teenager, ESPN Classics still aired some of the stuff from the 70s with Ralphie Valadares and Skinny Minnie and the greatest female heel of all time, wrestling or roller derby, whatever, Miss Georgia Haas. Miss Georgia Haas. Fantastic.
Miss Georgia Haas.
That's right.
Well, and for all of you who remember roller derby like I do the first time around, or from limited reinventions and replays like Brian, this is not a book on the history of the sport per se, but it focuses on the team of the LA T-Birds and the roller games that the T-Birds were the top team for. There was also the roller derby, which was started back in the 30s by the Seltzer family, and then the roller games came along in about 1960. And it's like a lot of the wrestling books. Scott Stevens, the guy that wrote it, was a skater, and then he went on to become a musician and has done a variety of things. But he spent a few years with the T-Birds right after the initial, down period, the first down period of the mid-'70s, when everything went to hell and never came really fully back. So he was around but he worked with some of the veterans, but also he was around for the newer, sort of like one of the in-between generations in wrestling. But anyway, so this is like the wrestling books in that it's a fan's book. I won't spoil anything for you when I tell you that you have to have some working knowledge, Brian, of what roller derby and roller games was to begin with to really enjoy this, like you should, like with a lot of the wrestling books where people just assume this is the audience, and it doesn't go into – and there's problems with – to me, with chronology, because it's a little all over the place with its chronology of things, but there's a lot of great information in this, and that's why, and pictures and everything, and that's why I liked it. But – and we'll probably do a show after you read it. We'll do a whole show on roller derby sometime, because that was the sport that was joined with wrestling in the 60s and 70s forever, and 50s for everybody that grew up watching TV in that period of time. But in this instance, there were similarities between wrestling and roller derby. And I always said, boy, if wrestling wasn't careful, it might end up in the same predicament. Now there's more than two companies. For a while, there was only two. But roller derby, as a sport and as a mainstream thing, went out of business in 1974. And there's been revivals, but it never came back like it was from the 50s through the 70s. And the similarities in wrestling, to me, were number one, the one guy was a businessman that owned one side, and the other one, it was a family business, which was sort of similar to the McMahon and TBS rivalry days. But at the same time, one roller derby was more serious sport with the gaga thrown in, whereas roller games was just out and out sports entertainment, sort of like the NWA and WWF, Crockett and Vince. So there were similarities, but it was the two worked sports on television that were drawing some of the largest live crowds. I mean, roller derby at their zenith put almost 50,000 people in the ballpark in Chicago. And they were doing huge business in California, both San Francisco and Los Angeles, and they would do the tours across the country. And, it was amazing business that just in a period of about a year and a half went under. Seltzer wanted to get out of the business. The oil crisis happened in 73, and it wasn't like the territory days of wrestling for roller derby. There were really only two companies, and they were both nationwide. But Seltzer was doing everything himself practically, and he decided to get out of the business. And Bill Griffiths, the guy that owned roller games, bought everything that Seltzer had, and then put the dream team together where Joni Weston and Ann Cavello, everybody was on the T-Birds. But that only lasted a year because, like when Crockett bought all the Phelan territories, he overextended himself, and he couldn't ride out certain, financial things that came up because he was all by himself. So it was like wrestling in that it was a small business that got so massive and for a while was so popular, but ultimately couldn't sustain itself because it was still at the heart a small business.
And it was
Did I do a pretty good wrap up for people who've never seen it before?
Yeah, really good wrap up. And, one of the other cool things when I first started seeing the replays of the old stuff, because when I was a kid, when I first got into wrestling, that's when Rock and Roller Games was on in 1989.
Oh, God, I hated that so bad.
See, as a kid, I loved it. As a kid, I thought it was cool, but I had never seen anything before that, so I had no frame of reference. But when I first saw the stuff from the 70s, it was in the Olympic. And it's like, wow, this is where all those wrestling photos I've seen by Theo Everett and Dan Westbrook, it was in the same building, the same sign behind it. And that was one of the things with roller games and roller derby in San Francisco and LA. It was in the Cow Palace and it was in the Olympic Auditorium. So you had an intermingling of the crowds. It was in the same buildings that housed the wrestling.
Yeah. And sometimes outdrew wrestling. And sometimes the TV ratings were every bit as good, if not better. And actually, Dick Lane, who did the Los Angeles wrestling program, also was the voice of the LA T-Birds.
Yeah.
Oh, Nelly. In San Francisco, my God, Ann Cavello was God and the Bay Bombers were God. When we started going to San Francisco in 86 for Crockett, I did, it was at the end of 86 into 87. I did one of the local promos and I said, let me tell you something, Rock and Roll Express, and I put my hands on my hips and said, we're going to cut off your jam right there in San Francisco, baby. And everybody got it, even though it was more than 10 years after the fact, because it was San Francisco. They had roller derby continuously on a local level, at least. It never left San Francisco and still do to this day. But, the Bay Bombers were the fucking team.
Am I getting confused? Did she date Ray Stevens at one point?
Yeah, I understand that Ann was wild enough to have dated a number of the boys. And I got to meet her one of the trips out to San Francisco, and I had a picture with her in the lobby of the hotel, and I don't know where that ever went because I can't find it now. But she was wild. She was one of the boys, and yeah, she dated a bunch of the boys, and Bobby Heenan knew her well, and I think I'm trying to think. He may have been the one because we were all there together. I think that was one of the times that the WWF guys were there. He may have been the one who introduced me. I don't know, but anyway.
How tan was she?
She looked like that referee the other day on NXT. She was so tan and had the bright cotton white hair. And she was 50-something, but, she always had, the body, right? And anyway, but this book, I wanted to read a couple things because, once again, this was a sport at heart, but it was worked for entertainment value. And roller derby and wrestling did this before they had the dunk contests in the NBA and before they brought showbiz and the lights and the entrances and everything into other sports. They still didn't, monkey with the game too much. But roller derby and wrestling were out there as a mix of sports and entertainment beforehand. As a matter of fact, Leo Seltzer, the guy that invented it in the 30s, originally, it was a marathon skating contest back in the Depression when they had the dance contest for 100 hours. It was and the marathon skating. And Damon Runyon, the sports writer, suggests to Leo Seltzer, hey, make this a game, make it a sport, have scoring and exaggerate shit, beef it up, probably like wrestling was doing at the time. Damon Runyon's a New York sports writer, and he's seeing all the goddamn publicity wrestling was getting in New York in the 30s for being entertainment. So anyway, they do this. And then, of course, just like wrestling, it became more and more entertainment, less and less sport. The one time that they tried to make roller derby a complete shoot, was in the 59-60 season. They decided they were going to make it a shoot, and it was legitimate scoring and everything. And because they had, who was it? It was Ralphie Valadares and maybe Mike Gammon, but God damn it. They had the two, Ralphie Valadares, and they had the two best, maybe it's John Hall. The two best male skaters in the business were both on the same team. So the fucking Bombers started winning literally 100-40 or whatever. So they had to go back to work in the next season because it was killing the fucking ticket sales because they were just smashing everybody. But especially and it was huge in the 50s on television and live. And it was kind of like wrestling, kind of, bubbled in the 60s and it was still hot. But then the 70s, it blew up again. But they learned a little bit too late, right after they had gone out of business, when they tried to resurrect the thing. Everybody that tried to resurrect it after the fact was going after the show business and not after the sport. And all the skaters that had come along that were actually legitimately tremendous skaters and had so much experience because they skated game after game after game. They ran San Jose every week in the season and then toured in another season around the country. So they skated relentlessly. They were better skaters. So just a couple of passages in this book. See if you could apply this to wrestling. The very mention of the word fake is offensive to most former pro skaters, and most will staunchly defend the integrity of their beloved sport. You'd be hard-pressed to find skaters who didn't have a severe injury while participating in the derby. Injuries are typically the first response when a derby skater is questioned about the legitimacy of the sport. There's no doubt that roller derby is a dangerous, violent, and often brutal sport, staged or not. And the athletic abilities of these performers cannot be questioned. Most skaters just wanted to be a professional athlete and not an actor. And then, hold on. There we go.
There you go.
When the game is executed well with top-level pros on the track, the believability and the potential for larger audiences increases. Keep in mind that it is these very antics of sports entertainment that allowed the sport to draw crowds at or above the NBA and NHL level during its heyday. The exaggerated action is what brought many of us to the game initially, whether we knew it at the time or not. But that same element, if executed poorly, results in disenchanted fans who don't come back. Therefore, it is a balancing act. How about this one? Hold on here. Got to get to the right place. He's listing a number of reasons for the death of roller derby, and there are 6 that he listed: a departure of an executive, purchase of the roller derby by Roller Games, the oil crisis, loss of TV syndication, because the roller games guy just didn't renew his syndication contract. He didn't want to spend the money. But also overexposed showmanship. Apparently, roller derby called their angles promotions, or their interviews and confrontations, whatever, the stuff that we would call angles and promos, they called promotions, right? Desperate to increase or at least sustain enough revenue to survive, Griffiths, the guy who ran Roller Games, pushed the boundaries of showmanship versus sportsmanship, increasing the number of scripted promotions, which alienated some fans and skaters. While it's true that these promotions typically enhanced attendance in the short term, a delicate balance between the proper dosage and overdose was needed. In 1974 and in future versions of Roller Games, this balance was disrupted and resulted in the damage of the league's reputation and ultimately lower fan turnout. Unless extra caution is taken in regards to the sheer volume of scripted acts implemented, as well as their precise execution, the perceived integrity of the game is compromised and fans slowly move on. And finally, hold on. You can edit that out if you want to. Whether you're a fan of the infamous Thunderbirds antics or what some would call sideshow, these scripted bits brought out more fans than just about anything else. However, there is a delicate balance in this business of sport versus show. Almost all the other top professional sports incorporate elements of showmanship to one degree or another. But where do you draw the line on the entertainment aspect? The answer should at least partially be based on how well-trained and skilled the talent is. The execution of anything done strictly to enhance viewer satisfaction should always be done carefully. Roller Games was guilty of getting carried away with this aspect of the game. Roller Derby, on the other hand, while still staging and scripting many parts of their game, did it with more restraint. Their game was more believable, and the talent was such that the execution was impeccable. As I pointed out in the previous chapter, one critical aspect of the demise of the mighty Thunderbirds was the gross overuse of physical altercations, scripted sideshow dramas, and predetermined winners and losers. Basically, what they were saying, it was the same thing when you had these guys that were legitimately world-class roller derby skaters, the Ray Stevenses and the Buddy Rogerses of roller derby, they could do this shit and pull it off because they were so good and it didn't look hokey. But when you have guys with less experience, with less talent, or just with less training and overall practice, trying to do shit that's as wild or even wilder than the shit that, they used to do in the old days, it looks hokey. It doesn't grab you. And that's where we've gone now, when whether it's too much about these scripted promotions or too much about the moves without the intent, that's where we've gone, I think.
It's pretty interesting. The parallels
Food for thought. Go ahead. Parallels.
Was there anything about wrestling in the book?
Yes, not as much as you would think, but he mentions it a bunch, but you can tell he didn't really know that much about wrestling otherwise than it would follow the same flavor. And he compared the two, but not really much detail. But, that's the thing. These people weren't necessarily wrestling fans. And most of the skaters were small, because smaller, at least, than the wrestlers you had to be to move around like that. They wanted to be skaters. But backstage and behind the scenes, apparently a lot of the skaters were like a lot of the wrestlers. They would not exactly be training like professional athletes in those days either. They'd be out at the bar or whatever. But anyway,